Hi, this is Mrs. Huffcutt at the Morrison Mary Wiley Library, and I have a new book to read for you. This is actually one that I read when I was a very young girl, and I really liked it, and I remembered it, and I thought I'd share it with you. It's called Miss Hickory, and it's by Carolyn Sherwin Bailey, and the art is done by Ruth Gannett. And just an interesting fact, this was the Newbery book in 1947, so it's a lot older than I am, to tell the truth. But, as I said, it's one I remember. Has some fun illustrations, Miss Hickory and an apple, just to give you some scale there. Let's see what happens in this book. First off, a couple of introductions. This is a note from the author. Except for Anne and Timothy, who have been given those names in place of their own, all the characters in this book are real. They are all living, save Doe, in the places where they live in the book. They all still behave just as they do in the story. So, who are those characters? Here are a list of the characters as they appear. Miss Hickory, a country woman whose body was an applewood twig and whose head was a hickory nut. Crow, tough and wise, also kindly. Great Granny Brown, who closed the old place and went to Boston for the winter. Mr. T. Willard Brown, a barn cat and a head ratter. Cock Pheasant, a famous berry picker who deserted his wife. Chipmunk, spoiled and flighty. Squirrel, most forgetful. Hen Pheasant, sad and without pep. Cow, who had a stomachache from overeating. Barn Heifer, cow's daughter who stayed at home. Wild Heifer, cow's daughter who roamed. Fawn, wild heifer's friend. Doe, with God. Groundhog, a surly man and afraid of his shadow. Bullfrog, who lost his winter clothes. Robin, a strutting fellow who felt important, and who came home from school. Timothy, of the farm next to the old place. And here's a picture to get you going. Chapter 1. Crow makes a call. Miss Hickory heard heavy footsteps clumping along the stones of the pasture, then approaching her lilac bush. Out of the corner of one sharp little black eye, she could see a pair of large yellow feet, but she did not turn her head. As a matter of fact, Miss Hickory had difficulty in turning her head. It was a hickory nut that had grown with an especially sharp and pointed nose. Her eyes and mouth were inked on. Her body was an applewood twig formed like a body with 2 arms and 2 legs, hand and feet, as twigs sometimes grow. To this body, Miss Hickory's nut head was glued. She wore a blue and white check gingham dress. A white cap with ruffles was tied in a smart bow beneath her chin. Many persons looking first at Miss Hickory would have said that she was a country doll made by Miss Ketterer, who kept the notion store in Hillsborough and given to Anne. But not you or I. The tilt of her sharp little nose, her pursed mouth, and her keen eyes were not those of a doll. You and I would have known Miss Hickory as the real person that she was. A black shadow passed the doorsill of Miss Hickory's house. Of course, "Caw!" seemed intended to catch her attention, but she continued sweeping with her broom that was made of pine needles. She had just finished her tea, and her acorn cup and saucer, neatly washed, stood on a shelf above the stove. A bed of discarded pullet's feathers covered with a bright quilt of patched sumac leaves was ready for pleasant dreams. Miss Hickory's house was made of corn cobs, notched, neatly fitted together, and glued. It stood beneath the lilac bush that was so sweet and purple when in bloom, so thickly green and cheerful with birds all summer long. If one had to live in town, Miss Hickory had always said, take a house under a lilac bush. Soon through her front door the sunset would toss a few colored pieces from the orchard sky. Soon, too, the sun would drop like the biggest apple in the world, red and round, behind Temple Mountain that guarded the orchard spring, summer, autumn, and winter, world without end. The sun set earlier now, for it was late September. Miss Hickory swept more briskly to warm herself. Thinking of cold weather made her shiver, but a large dark head with beady eyes and a long bill thrust in through the window stopped her. "Are you at home, Miss Hickory?" Crow asked in his hoarse voice. "Well, what do you think, if you ever do think?" she asked. "I heard your big yellow clodhoppers, and I saw you pass by. If you think there is one kernel of corn left in my house walls that you can peck out, you are mistaken. You have eaten them all." "Dear lady," said Crow, stooping, entering, and making himself at home. "Always so polite, so generous." A small smile seemed to move the wrinkles on Miss Hickory's face. "Here." She took from her pocket a few hard yellow kernels and held them out. Crow gobbled, choked, bowed low. "Don't try to thank me," she urged. "You'll get the hiccups. What is the news? If there is any, you have heard it." "Precisely why I am here," as they put it over the radio. He said, "News indeed, and it concerns you." Miss Hickory sat down on her toadstool, spreading her skirts neatly to cover her ankles. Crow rested his wings comfortably, eased his toes, and leaned against the wall. These two might spat and tiff, but they had fellow feelings. Crow made no pretensions. He was a countryman. The earth owed him a living, and so he helped himself to cherries and corn. Summer boarders, the bluebirds, thrushes, and larks could fend for themselves. Crow felt, paying high prices for any berries and seeds they got from his feeding ground. But he knew what was going on throughout the entire countryside. He was tough and weather-wise. He set the date for Old Crowd Week in Hillsboro every spring, and so started the season with noisy promise. He could walk as well as fly, which meant that he got around more than most birds. He knew that Miss Hickory had once been part of a tree, and he respected her for that ancestry. In certain ways they were alike. He waited for her to speak. "Well," she said at last. Crow folded his wings over his stomach and pointed his beak at Miss Hickory. "Great Granny Brown is closing this house for the winter. She plans to live in the Women's City Club on Beacon Hill, Boston, until spring." The house was full of stillness for a while, thick with thoughts that could not break it. His words stunned Miss Hickory. She could not speak. "I know," Crow said at last, "that you expected to live another winter, house and all, on Great Granny Brown's kitchen windowsill. You expected Anne to drop in almost every day and bring you something useful, a little iron stove, a pot, or a tin tea kettle. But the entire family is going to Boston. Anne is to be put into school there." Crow rolled his eyes toward the ceiling, pretending to be shocked. Truly, however, he was enjoying himself. A love of gossip is hatched from every crow's egg. Miss Hickory arose. She came close to him, her sharp little nose almost touching his face. "They could not! They would not!" "Ah, yes, Miss Hickory," he assured her. "Two-leggers who've been to Boston long for wings. Only we country people who can fly never feel the need of a city. Now, I once knew a starling who went to the public gardens in Boston for a visit, but—" "Stop! Don't gabble!" Miss Hickory twisted her hands in distress. "Come to the point." "The point is yours, Miss dear lady." Crow tapped her shoulder playfully with one wing-tip. "You have seen through Great Granny Brown's kitchen window how deep the snowdrifts are in New Hampshire. I'll wager that there were days when you could not see through the windows. The winters are long and hard here, Miss Hickory." "What could one do?" she begged. She would not believe him yet. "Don't feel too badly, as if they had forgotten you," he said kindly. "Anne has other matters than dolls to fill her mind now. Great Granny Brown was born and bred in New Hampshire. She expects you to be equal to any weather. You'll have to move, Miss Hickory." "Where?" She went over to the window and looked west. There, each year, the forest, wild and deep, marched closer to the old place. They had both forgotten to admire the sunset. The afterglow, like a blanket of woven rainbows, had folded about Temple Mountain. "Aye, that's the rub," Crow replied hoarsely. Miss Hickory stamped her foot. "Don't talk like a poll parrot. Whatever you hear, either the radio or William Shakespeare, you repeat. You know you can't read a word." Crow bowed his head humbly. "Right you are. But what I meant was that we shall have to make a plan, and make it speedily. You can't live under a lilac bush all winter." "We? This isn't your house. It belongs to me. I like it here. I can't move. Where would I take my stove, my pot, and my tea kettle, my cup and saucer, and my bed? If I lived in a crow's nest with no nice house furnishings and no good housekeeping." She could not say any more. She could only look with love and fear at her 4 corncob walls. "You give me an idea, Miss Hickory." Crow balanced himself on one foot and scratched his head with the other. "I will have no idea of yours." "But a little change is good for us all," Crow said smirkingly. "You must remember, dear lady, that you weren't born with a cup and saucer in your hand." It was more than Miss Hickory could stand. She lost her temper. "I believe that this is all a piece of gossip on your part, Crow. I shall never believe the old place is empty until I ask Mr. T. Willard Brown. He will tell me the truth. As for you, Crow," she stood as tall and brave as she could beside her door, "Get out of my house," she ordered. "As you wish." Crow walked in a dignified manner toward the door. "But don't worry, something is bound to turn up." "I won't move," she repeated as he stepped across the threshold. But he tapped her head lightly with his beak. "Hard-headed, that's what you are." And with that, Crow walked off in the direction of the pine wood, he and the falling night one in the color of dusk. Miss Hickory put her twig hands up to her nut head. Crow, she knew, was right. There's a picture of Crow. Her head was undoubtedly hard. She moved slowly about her house, lifting a stove lid to poke the red coals, turning down her bedspread. But as she comforted herself with these homely tasks, a feeling that she had never experienced before came to Miss Hickory. Perhaps it was caused by the sap that was still in her twig potty. Perhaps it was the essence of the sweet nut inside the hard shell of her head. Whatever caused it, Miss Hickory began to cry. Tears came out of her eyes and rolled down her wrinkled cheeks. They fell so fast that she had to staunch them with her cap ties. It was dark then, so no one saw her break down. No one heard Miss Hickory sob, "It isn't true. I won't move. Mr. T. Willard Brown will tell me tomorrow that I only had a bad dream." That's the end of chapter 1.